Hello and welcome to the Drexel interview. I'm your host, Paula Marantz Cohen, speaking to you from the university's picture gallery. Our guest today is Daniel Esty, Hill House Professor and Director of Environmental Law and Policy at Yale University. Before coming to Yale, Dan Esty was a fellow at the Institute for International Economics in Washington, D.C., and served in senior positions in the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. He's the author of 8 books on environmental policy. His most recent, with Andrew S. Winston, is entitled Green to Gold: How Smart Companies Use Environmental Strategy to Innovate, Create Value, and Build Competitive Advantage. Dan Esty, welcome to the Drexel interview.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, I want to start by noting something I saw in the New York Times today, which is that a group of European leaders, leaders of the European Union, met today to talk about possibly cutting back on some of their notions of environmental, forward-looking environmental change in light of the financial crisis. And this strikes me as a rather sad event. And I wonder if it's the beginning of what we're going to see now with the financial crisis, whether in fact environmental issues are going to now be put on the back burner.
So I think there is a challenge whenever you have people feeling real pain, as they do, around the economic circumstances. People are very worried. Jobs are being lost. People are losing their homes. Retirement accounts are shrinking. And there's no denying it. But I think the misunderstanding here is that somehow there's a trade-off between economic progress and environmental progress. And what you see in the European Union is actually a split, where some of the leaders have started to say, wait a minute, we can't go forward with our climate change action plan. But the smart ones, I would say, are saying, no, wait a minute, we can't slow down. Because in fact, investment in a clean energy future, bringing to bear society's efforts and all of the talent across society, the venture capital, the innovators, the creative companies, the entrepreneurs, to help drive toward a clean alternative energy future where we're more efficient in our use of fossil fuels, but also moving towards alternative energy, offers the promise of lifting the economy and moving us out from under a number of the problems we face. And frankly, beyond that, there's a geostrategic element here. If we actually get alternative sources of supply, that's renewable energy at home, we don't have to be dependent on the Middle East and the difficult lines of fossil fuel supply that go through that part of the world.
Well, you've touched on lots of things there, and I want to get to some of them. But first of all, I was struck in your book, you mentioned the fact, for the last 10 years, you have been attending this annual World Economic Forum in Switzerland. And that forum rates countries in terms of their economic performance. And you have initiated a rating for environmental performance. And what you've discovered is that it's not impossible to have a very high environmental rating as well as a high economic rating. Switzerland being a case in point. They're number 2 economically, number 1 environmentally. Where does the U.S. stand in this sort of rating? And is there a problem here?
Well, so first of all, we've again demonstrated that economic success and environmental success don't compete, but actually reinforce each other. That countries that are doing well economically often are able to invest in the environment. Ones that have managed their environment well have a foundation of natural resources to build economic strength on. So I think it's a very important conclusion because it runs contrary to the old thinking that you couldn't pay attention to the environment until you got rich. And I think that just turns out to be wrong. I think with regard to the United States, our ranking is not very strong. We're put in the 30s as opposed to sort of top 5 or top 10. And when I rank countries from 1 to 150 and the U.S. doesn't appear in the top tier, people are surprised in the United States. They say, wow, we thought we were better than that. Of course, when I present this in Europe, people are surprised the U.S. is as high as 30th rank because they understand the U.S. to be a terrible polluted country that does terribly on greenhouse gas emissions. And I think the truth is somewhere in the middle. The U.S. is actually very good on some environmental issues. No country does better in terms of providing safe drinking water, in terms of screening for chemical in food, in terms of forests and managing a sustainable forestry. So we're very good on some things, but in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, in terms of waste, we're not good. We're near the bottom. So we've got a lot to learn, and that's another lesson of the ranking. Every country, including Switzerland at the top, has some issues across the 25 that we're ranking people on where they underperform their peer group. Switzerland, in fact, is the worst in the world on one issue. And I think everyone, therefore, has something to learn by understanding where they're good and where they're not so good, and by looking at what the leaders are doing well with.
What is Switzerland the worst in the world in?
In terms of agricultural sustainability. They subsidize agriculture. They have these cows on steep slopes, and they have not managed their agriculture in a very environmentally thoughtful way.
Oh, interesting. Well, I think you've sort of moved into the next question, which is my the 6 areas, the policy areas that you map out as being important. I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about the priority in which you feel they need to be dealt with, at least from the point of view of our country. Air pollution, biodiversity and habitat, climate change, environmental health, and maybe you'll define what's meant by that, productive natural resources, and water resources. Well, I wasn't clear about environmental health because that would seem to encompass all of them. What does that mean?
We break the sort of ranking down into 2 halves. Half of our weight is placed on issues that relate to human impacts from the environment, so exposure of humans. The other half is protecting nature and how ecological resources are protected. So we think roughly those have to be given equal weight. Half the story is about humans and direct pollution impacts, and half is about protecting our natural world. So within the United States, we're actually pretty good at the environmental public health. We've invested a lot in safe drinking water. We have invested a lot in good sanitation, in waste treatment systems. So that is not where we have problems.
So we think about people, but we don't think about the larger context. Is that what you're really saying?
Exactly. So we've invested in the direct impacts on people, but we haven't done as much to realize we live within a world that we're ultimately dependent on as well. And if we run down our stock of natural resources, if we don't manage our fisheries well, we don't look at how agriculture affects the quality of rivers and water, we're going to have problems down the line. And frankly, the issue that's most difficult in the United States is climate change. And we put a lot of weight on that because this is a threat ultimately to the entire survivability of the planet. You know, not in the short run, but if we really neglect this, we could leave ourselves in 100 years in a very bad place.
So
and our children and grandchildren would pay the price.
So in terms of priority, which you're saying that climate change is the #1 priority?
Well, I think from the United States point of view, climate change is an overarching issue of tremendous significance because it's so intertwined with our energy structure and our need to move to a clean energy future. And it has these subsidiary elements of, if we really address it in a thoughtful, constructive way, we can drive economic growth, we can help lift the country out of the chaos that we're in from an economic point of view, and also it helps get at these core strategic questions about whether we remain entangled in the Middle East. And I think the American public at this point is deeply frustrated about Iraq, frankly not very happy about the whole Middle East, where we seem not to understand how that world works, that people don't seem to share our values. So the hope here is by shifting over the next decade or two to a clean energy path, we can open up new lines of energy supply, get ourselves out from under a dependence on foreign oil, and that has the benefit of potentially bringing prices down, of ensuring that we have job growth at home by pushing for new companies to develop new lines of opportunity, and changing our geostrategic dependence on that Middle East. And frankly, the American public, I think, has come to realize that even if we got out of the Middle East, if we're fossil fuel dependent, then we have to rely on Russia and Kazakhstan and Nigeria and Venezuela. It's almost a laundry list of countries you don't want your economic lifeline running through. And I think that is something the American public's gotten clear on, and the new president is clearly going to have to take action in this direction.
It's interesting, as you speak, I realize, politically now there is, the politics of the situation is driving, in a sense, a concern for the environment in a way that we haven't seen in the past.
Well, I think we've got 4 revolutions in thinking around the environment going on simultaneously. The politics has changed dramatically. Public attitudes have changed. We have a public that cares a lot about the environment, not only about climate change, which is suddenly a broad-based concern, but about availability of safe water, about chemicals in food. All this melamine in milk has really got people upset. I think we have a policy world that is coming to realize they have to regulate in new and more clever ways, more economic incentive-based regulation, less old-style command and control. And I think all of that goes to a final sort of revolution in thinking, which is around energy. We've got to move on to a different energy future. And whether it's 10 or 20 or 30 or 40 years, we know we've got to move beyond fossil fuels.
So everything is coming together to affect this paradigm shift, or whatever you want to call it. But it's, what do you think?
Well, let me just say, you asked about the economic crisis. So from one hand, you could say, wow, it's a bad time to be focused on the environment. There's all these distractions. On the other hand, if you think about it in this sort of integrated way, you think, no, environment is going to be part of the solution that gets us out from where we are, out of our economic trouble, out of our political difficulties, out of our foreign entanglements, and really could be part of the solution to where we go.
I see that. I see that. What would you say, though, was the turning point for this change in attitude? You say that people now are environmentally aware, and I think you're absolutely right. And there was a sea change at some point. I don't know exactly when. I mean, can you?
I think it was a number of things that came together. I think there's always a tendency for people to react against extremes in our political situation. And frankly, the Bush administration was extreme in neglect for the environment. And I think a lot of people who were not environmentalists began to worry that we weren't doing enough. So the mainstream of concern broadened, in part because the Bush administration took such a kind of isolated corner position on the issue. And I give Al Gore some credit. He turned out to be much better as an environmental educator than he ever was as a politician. I mean, he's actually really funny, engaging, charming, and interesting when he talks about climate change. And you can quibble with some issues in the sort of corners of his Inconvenient Truth book or movie, but he's done a remarkable job at lifting this issue up to the public. I think Hurricane Katrina had an impact as well. Climate change in particular is kind of a distant thing. It was arising over decades or even 100 years, and people didn't have a sense of urgency or even a picture of what it might mean. But those images of death and destruction and devastation and chaos coming out of New Orleans made it clear to people that there is a price to be paid for inaction. And it also made clear that it's not just global warming we're worried about. It's all the spin-offs. It's more intense hurricanes and windstorms. It's rising sea levels. It's changing rainfall patterns. So all of this converges along with, and of course that's the story of my Green to Gold book, a business community that has come to understand that environment's not just about regulations to follow and costs to bear and risks to manage, but that there is an upside opportunity. That as we begin to invest in water systems and taking chemicals out of our society and solving the climate change problem, somebody's going to sell a lot of new goods and services, and the people that do have a big potential for profits.
Well, your book does deal with this notion that it is good business, profitable business, to be environmentally sound. And yet, I wonder if you're sugarcoating this a bit. I mean, don't you think it's neglect and greed that's gotten us to this point, and a degree of sacrifice is going to be necessary, and perhaps it's impossible. You can paint a rosy picture, but then you're skirting some of the harder facts involved here.
So first of all, I think it is absolutely true that markets don't work without regulations and rules. And I think one of the sort of lessons of our recent economic troubles is that we no longer should debate whether it's regulation or deregulation. That's totally put aside. The question is, how do we regulate in a thoughtful, serious, but economically efficient manner? And for those of us who've been in the trenches there for 10 or 15 years, we're thrilled to have this be the debate now. So government doesn't go away in my vision of the future, but it has to be very clever, because the key to progress turns out to be engaging the business community in generating new technologies, in developing alternative energy, and finding ways to make us more energy efficient. So it's not just about telling companies what they can't do, it's about engaging them and helping them show us what we all can do to move on to a better future.
So what companies would you point to as exemplary in this regard?
Well, Chad Holliday of DuPont is on the cover. It has the cover quote on my book, in part because he's been a model of helping redirect a company that's a big old line chemical company, and it's got lots of issues around the chemicals it's produced and the products it's made, but he's done a phenomenal job in helping them think through how environment and sustainability needs to be core to the strategy of the business. He's been extraordinary in bringing cost cutting through a focus on the environment to the business. He's really driven a reduced risk model where they're understanding where there are challenges presented by environment